तथा कृपयाविष्टम् अश्रुपूर्णाकुलेक्षणम् विषीदन्तमिदम् वाक्यम् उवाच मधुसूदनः। श्रीभगवानुवाच कुतस्त्वाकश्मलमिदम् विषमे समुपस्थितम् अनार्यजुष्टमस्वर्ग्यम् अकीर्तिकरमर्जुन क्लैब्यम् आस्मगमः पार्थ नैतत्त्वय्युपपद्यते क्षुद्रम् हृदयदौर्बल्यम् त्यक्त्वोत्तिष्ठ परन्तप। अर्जुन उवाच कथम् भीष्ममहम् सङ्ख्ये द्रोणम् च मधुसूदन इषुभिः प्रतियोत्स्यामि पूजार्हावरिसूदन। गुरून् हत्वा हि महानुभावान् श्रेयो भोक्तुम् वैक्ष्यमपीह लोके हत्वार्थकामांस्तु गुरूनिहैव भुञ्जीय भोगान् रुधिरप्रदिग्धान् न चैतद्विद्मः कतरन्नो गरीयः यद्वा जयेम यदि वा नो जयेयुः यानेव हत्वा न जिजीविषामः तेव स्थिताः प्रमुखे दात्तराष्ट्राः कार्पण्यदोषोपहतः स्वभावः पृच्छामि त्वाम् धर्मसम्मूढचेताः यश्रेयस्यान्निश्चितम् ब्रूहि तन्मे शिष्यस्तेऽहम् शाधि माम् त्वाम् प्रपन्नम् न हि प्रपश्यामि ममापनुद्यात् यच्छोकमुच्छोषणमिन्द्रियाणाम् अवाप्य भूमावसपत्रमृद्धम् राज्यम् सुराणामपि चाधिपत्यम्। सञ्जय उवाच एवमुक्त्वा हृषीकेशम् गुडाकेशः परन्तप न योत्स्य इति गोविन्दम् उक्त्वा तूष्णीम् बभूवः। तमुवाच हृषीकेशः प्रहसन्निव भारत सेनयोरुभयोर्मध्ये विषीदन्तमिदम् वचः। श्रीभगवानुवाच अशोच्यानन्वशोचस्त्वम् प्रज्ञावादांश्च भाषसे गतासु न गतासूंश्च नानुशोचन्ति पण्डिताः न त्वेवाहम् जातु नासम् न त्वम् नेमे जनाधिपाः न चैव न भविष्यामः सर्वे वयमतः परम् देहिनोऽस्मिन् यथा देहे कौमारम् यौवनम् जरा तथा देहान्तरप्राप्तिः धीरस्तत्र न मुह्यति मात्रा स्पर्शास्तु कौन्तेय शीतोष्णसुखदुःखदाः आगमापायिनो नित्याः ताम् स्थितिक्षस्व भारत यम् हि न व्यथयन्त्येते पुरुषम् पुरुषर्षभ समदुःखसुखम् धीरम् सोमृतत्वाय कल्पते नासतो विद्यते भावः नाभावो विद्यते सतः उभयोरपि दृष्टोऽन्तः त्वनयोस्तत्त्वदर्शिः अविनाशि तु तद्विद्धि येन सर्वमिदम् ततम् विनाशमव्ययस्यास्य न कश्चित् कर्तुमर्हति अन्तवन्त इमे देहाः नित्यस्योक्ताः शरीरिणः अनाशिनो प्रमेयस्य तस्माद्युध्यस्व भारत येनम् वेत्ति हन्तारम् यश्चैनम् मन्यते हतम् उभौ तौ न विजानीतः नायम् हन्ति न हन्यते न जायते म्रियते वा कदाचित् नायम् भूत्वा भविता वा न भूयः अजो नित्यः शाश्वतोऽयम् पुराणः न हन्यते हन्यमाने शरीरे वेदा विनाशिनम् नित्यम् येनमजमव्ययम् कथम् स पुरुषः पार्थ खं घातयति हन्तिकम् वासांसि जीर्णानि यथा विहाय नवानि गृह्णाति नरोपराणि तथा शरीराणि विहाय जीर्णानि अन्यानि संयाति नवानि देहि नैनं छिन्दन्ति शस्त्राणि नैनं दहति पावकः न चैनं क्लेदयन्त्यापः न शोषयति मारुतः अच्छेद्योऽयमदाह्योऽयम् अक्लेद्यो शोष्य एव च नित्यः सर्वगतस्थाणुः अचलोऽयम् सनातनः अव्यक्तोऽयमचिन्त्योऽयम् अविकार्योऽयमुच्यते तस्मादेवम् विदित्वैनम् नानुशोचितुमर्हसि अथ चैनम् नित्यजातम् नित्यम् वा मन्यसे मृतम् तथापि त्वम् महाबाहो नैवम् शोचितुमर्हसि जातस्य हि ध्रुवो मृत्युः ध्रुवम् जन्म मृतस्य च तस्मादपरिहार्येऽर्थे न त्वम् शोचितुमर्हसि अव्यक्तादीनि भूतानि व्यक्तमध्यानि भारत अव्यक्तनिधनान्येव तत्र का परिदेवना आश्चर्यवत्पश्यति कश्चिदेनम् आश्चर्यवद्वदति तथैव चान्यः आश्चर्यवच्चैनमन्यः शृणोति श्रुत्वाप्येनम् वेद न चैव कश्चित् देही नित्यमवध्योऽयम् देहे सर्वस्य भारत तस्मात् सर्वाणि भूतानि न त्वम् शोचितुमर्हसि स्वधर्ममपि चापेक्ष्य न विकम्पितुमर्हसि धर्म्याद्धियुद्धात् श्रेयोऽन्यः क्षत्रियस्य न विद्यते
पृथिवी शान्तिरन्तरिक्षगं शान्तिर्द्यौः शान्तिर्दिशः शान्तिरवान्तरदिशा शान्तिरग्निः शान्तिर्वायुः शान्तिरादित्यः शान्तिश्चन्द्रमा शान्तिर्नक्षत्राणि शान्तिरापः शान्तिरोषधयः शान्तिर्वनस्पतयः शान्तिर्गौः शान्तिरजा शान्तिरश्वः शान्तिः पुरुषः शान्तिर्ब्रह्म शान्तिर्ब्राह्मणः शान्तिः शान्तिरेव शान्तिः शान्तिर्मे अस्तु शान्तिः. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukkha bhag bhavet. Sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu, sarvas sadbuddhimapnotu, Sarvas Sarvatra Nandato. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Om Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravirmayeti Rudrayatte Takshinam Mukham Te Namam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. So we shall resume our study of the Gita, the reflections on some of the themes that we have been discussing. Last week we saw how the question of identity is so important. Apparently, Arjuna's dilemma and Krishna's answer don't seem to match right away. And then in that context, we saw why Krishna begins by describing the nature of the self. How we respond to a situation, how we take decisions in life, how we make choices in life is very directly related to how we see ourselves, our identity. And as we saw, we carry multiple identities in our life. Yeah, not in a kind of a like multiple personality disorder, not that kind. I'm not really referring to that. What I'm saying is that simultaneously we have many different identities and we shuffle through them so effortlessly that we are not even aware of it. So when we are in the presence of our parents, then our identity as a son or a daughter, it comes to the fore. And with that identity firmly, that I am a son or I am a daughter, the way I speak with my parents, the choices I make in that moment are appropriate to that relationship, to that context. And then maybe immediately after meeting my parents, I go home, I see my family, and there they're my children. So then, when I'm in the presence of my children, me, who only a minutes before was a son or a daughter, now has become a father or a mother. And therefore, the way then I speak with my children or the decisions I make are appropriate to the relationship I have with them, but that relationship is connected with the identity I have at that moment. So our identity is very significant. And especially when we are confused, when we have dilemmas in life, it's always helpful. A lot of times what happens is we are so taken up by the objective elements, the objective realities, that we often forget the subject that is dealing with all these objects. And Swami Vivekananda once wrote to his English disciple, his name was Goodwin, he was a stenographer. He was the one who took down most of Swamiji's lectures and conversations. In fact, most of the complete works that we have today are because of this amazing work that Goodwin did. But for him, there was no taping technology in Swamiji's time. All of that would have been lost if we didn't have such an efficient stenographer like Goodwin who took it down. So we are all very grateful to him for that. To him, Swamiji once wrote in a letter that we Vedantists must always look at everything from a subjective standpoint. So instead of asking the question, why is this person that way? Or why is this situation that way? A subjective approach would be, why am I seeing it that way? And so this I is very important. And that's what really Krishna is trying to do here. This dilemma that Arjuna has, and Krishna is saying, well, who is this I that is confused? In a very radical way, in more recent times, this was an idea that we find in the life and teachings of Ramana Maharshi, for instance, or Nisargadatta Maharaj. These are the two names that come right away to my mind. How everything can be seen from a very subjective way. So this identity is very important. And sometimes the external factors can help me in reaffirming my identity, in stabilizing my identity. By that I mean, oftentimes we know, for instance, they say that to go to a religious service, when you go to a church or a temple, generally people say there is an appropriate appropriate kind of a dress code. Now we might say, well, sometimes people don't like this whole idea of a dress code. Like why can't we just wear whatever we like? And of course we can, but there is a great benefit if I have, say, a certain dress kept aside for my meditation practices, or when I go to visit a temple, then putting on that dress, I'm affirming my identity at that moment. That now, with this dress on, what I'm going to do and what I'm going to say and what I'm going to think is primarily as a devotee or as a spiritual seeker. And that is why oftentimes teachers advise their students to keep one set of clothes aside for their meditation practice. That don't use those clothes for anything else. The reason is, again, it's just a law of association. If a certain dress is associated with my meditation practice, then every time I put that on, both my body and mind know it's time for meditation. It's just law of association. For instance, in many of the centers of the Ramakrishna order, in many Vedanta societies, we chant a verse from the Gita before meals. It's in 4th chapter, 24th verse, I think, and we'll come to that. Brahmarpanam Brahmahavi, those of you who have attended programs at the Vedanta Center are very familiar with that verse. Now, that verse doesn't directly deal with food, but it has a deep philosophical significance to this whole all activities, but specifically the activity of eating. So, because of that association of that verse with meals, so one person used to say that every time I chant the Gita and I come to that verse, then immediately I automatically feel, oh, it's time to eat. Now, that's what I mean by that law of association. So, if I can keep one, as far as it is possible, a one place or one seat or one cushion aside for my meditation practice, one set of clothes, try to do it around the same time every day. So all these association of time, place, these help in strengthening my identity as a meditator or as a spiritual seeker. So that's the advantage of affirming that identity, because that identity then will help me in the activity that is appropriate at that time and at that place and for that identity. Which is why, well, nowadays, many of us are working from home. And while it might seem a great advantage to be working from home, you are saving so much time in not having to commute to work. Many people have observed that working from home, while it has many advantages, it can be at some time disadvantageous, because then when you have to commute to work, your work time is very clearly separated from your family time. But when you're working from home, it just gets merged. And then either you will find that you're not working at all, or you will find that you're working too much. And try it if you have not tried it before, but many people have said that even if you are working from home, it might be helpful to pretend as if you are going to work. So the time your work starts, be at your desk at that time. It might even be helpful, although we might say, well, I'm just sitting at home, no one can see me, I can just work in my pajamas, which you can, theoretically you can. But it might help that whatever clothes you wear to go to work, your work clothes, wear them at the time, sit before your desk. Don't allow any other family matters, unless it's of course very urgent, to intrude into that. Then when your work time is over, change into your home clothes, don't think about your work thing again. Unless again, of course, there is always exceptions. If something is extremely urgent, that's different. But that's what I mean by having a separate set of clothes, which will then help me do appropriate things at the appropriate time. So that's the question. All it centers around identity. And that's the crux of Vedantic practice. The Vedantic worldview is based on in the Vedantic framework that my present identity as a human being, as a mortal creature, subject to the forces of this external world, subject to the process of aging, sickness, death, at the level of the mind, prone to stress, anxiety, and then of course dealing with memories and memories of the past, anxiety about the future, my prejudices, my biases, my loves, my hatreds, all of these things are tied to my identity as it is. And we sometimes find ways to try to remove the factors that bring suffering to us, remove the factors that bring pain in our lives, and try to bolster those factors which make us happy. And while we do succeed to a lesser or greater degree, we find that the problem is never solved permanently. It's a constant fight. It's a constant struggle of keeping suffering at bay and somehow trying to get as much joy as possible. And in some ways, it is a losing fight, a losing battle. Because even as we are engaged in always trying to find ways to be happy and trying to avoid suffering, time is running out. We are getting older by day, and then one day we are going to die. And it doesn't seem like death is a solution to the problem at all. So Vedanta identifies that this problem cannot be solved by trying to manipulate or change the external reality. That the world, the external world, the objective world is much too powerful. It has forces that cannot be controlled by the limited energy and resources that my body and mind have. So the only way to solve the problem is not by changing the world, but by changing myself. A story we read in our childhood was this, that long before, all these stories in childhood, like long, long ago, whatever that means. So here was this one king who went riding on a horse riding deep into the forest, and that kingdom had lots of dust, and there's too much of dust, and the dust went to the king's eyes, and he was like annoyed, and he said, this has got to stop. This problem of dust is terrible, and my feet are getting soiled wherever I go. So he ordered that his entire kingdom be covered, the flooring covered with some material, so that this dirt and dust will not will not bother him when he walks. And kings got weird ideas in those days. Kings were weird. And in modern times also, the modern kings, sometimes the presidents could be weird as well. So, there are leaders who sometimes are sensible, sometimes are not. So this king said, well, cover the entire floor of the kingdom with this. And then one of his advisors came and said, I have a better solution. I'm sure he probably didn't say better, because to have a better solution than the king would have been disastrous. He probably said, there's another way we can look at it. And he said, instead of covering this entire floor, entire land of the kingdom with something, why don't we all just cover our feet? And that is how shoes were born. We don't know whether this is really what happened, but the idea is making a change outside is so much more difficult than just making a change within. And that is the Vedantic solution. The problem of suffering can be solved not by changing the world. Because if it were possible to change the world, we would have done it long back. Considering that the basic elements of the world have not changed in these millions of years, your mileage might vary, but I'm not very hopeful that the world is going to change all that much. It will change superficially, yes. More than 100 years ago, there were no automobiles and jet travel and iPhones. Technology has changed, and we might keep on saying, well, the world is changing so much. And in a way, yes, the world is changing. But in a way also, no. The deeper characteristics of the world, I don't think have changed at all. Just read history and read contemporary life. Not much. There is still ambition. There is still exploitation, inequality, the powerful ruling over the weak, the learned trying to use their knowledge to undermine and exploit the ignorant. And then, of course, there are also the forces of good. The other side of forces of generosity, love, people trying to always do what is right. But that's been the world. There are forces trying to do what is right, and there are forces who are trying to sabotage it. That was true 5,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, and we can, learning from history, we can see that probably will be true as long as this world lasts as we know it. So changing the world seems a hopeless task. What is not hopeless, what is possible, is to change myself. And changing myself really means changing my identity. And that is what Krishna is doing here. That's why he begins by telling Arjuna about the nature of the self. So that's one thing about the importance of identity. The second thing, and you might remember I mentioned last week that these few verses in the beginning, when Krishna is describing the nature of the Atman, the nature of the self, that we can, it's easy to think that, well, this is how the Atman is. But that's not the intended meaning, because if my identity, my true identity is that I am the Atman, then when Krishna says the Atman is indestructible, I should hear not that some kind of an Atman is indestructible, I am indestructible. So to translate these words in our own heads. I'd given one example last Sunday, that when the teacher says, and this is the kind of a classical example given in Vedantic tradition, when the teacher says, Tattvamasi, you are that infinite being. Now that's often called the Upadesha Vakya, the words that the teacher tells the student, Tattvamasi. And here the word tvam, you are that. So what does the student hear? Now if the student is not yet completely ready for that teaching, the student will hear and say, oh, tattvamasi, the self, the Atman is Brahman. That's one way of hearing what is being said. Another way of hearing is tattvamasi. It's a little bit like, think about it this way. If someone were to say, you are stupid, now what do you hear? When someone tells you you are stupid, the words that you hear, the words are clear. Obviously, if your ears are in working condition, and if someone said you are stupid, you are hearing the sound and then the corresponding word that you are stupid. But that's one hearing. But the second hearing is when someone says you are stupid, you are hearing is this person is saying I am stupid. Although that person is not saying I am stupid, that person is saying you are stupid. But why it hurts you is because you're saying this person thinks I am stupid. And then usually that's not the only thing that people hear. So suppose the person says you are stupid. Then first thing you hear in your head is this fellow thinks I'm stupid. But then you start hearing a lot of other things in your head. This person hates me. This person has never liked me from the beginning. That's why this person says all this to me. This person has been nasty to me. So this person has only said you are stupid. And you are hearing now so many different things in the head. So that's really what I'm getting at. So when Krishna told Arjuna, the Atman is indestructible, what did Arjuna hear? And the answer is, we don't know. Well, only Arjuna knows what Arjuna heard. And who cares what Arjuna heard? Now when we read this dialogue, we can say, what if Krishna were telling this to me, that the Atman is indestructible? What would I hear? And ideally, what I should hear is, I am indestructible. Because that's the intent of Krishna, is to say, you are the Atman. Which is why I said that if you can, I'd given you as a home assignment, I have no idea how many of you did it. One amongst you did send it to me via email, the assignment. The others, of course, I didn't ask you to send it to me, but I hope you at least tried. If not, I have tried. Well, I did my assignment. So I tried to do it, and some of you might have noticed on the same website that you have gone to see this live stream, I uploaded that text. If you might find it on your site. If not, I will read it out to you now. So this is a very brief summary. Again, your version of it doesn't have to be exactly identical with this, but this is what I meant. In the text that you will see on the page, I have put the verse numbers in parentheses, but I'm just going to read you the text now. This begins from verse 12 and goes right up to verse 25 in second chapter. So this is what I came up with. I have always existed and I will always continue to exist. To me, rebirth is just a stage, no different from other stages such as childhood, youth, and old age. I am imperishable. No one has the power to destroy me. I am eternal, imperishable, and immeasurable. I am birthless and deathless. I am not killed when this body is killed. Death and rebirth are merely changing one body for another, the way a worn-out dress is replaced by a new one. I cannot be cut, burnt, wetted, or dried. I am changeless, all-pervading, stable, immovable, and eternal. I cannot be perceived by the senses, nor imagined by the mind. So this is one way of a very brief summary of what Krishna told Arjuna and what hopefully Arjuna heard. As you can see, and when you study these verses carefully, you will see that there are repetitions. There are certain descriptions, certain descriptive adjectives are repeated. That's okay. The repetition in Vedic study, they say that it's called in Sanskrit punarukti doshaha. That is, if something is repeated, that's a defect in that textual. When you analyze the text, repetitions are generally considered a defect. So it's called punarukti, repeating, saying it again, doshaha, it's a defect. Now, a lot of these things are repeated throughout the Upanishads. And therefore, because of this tradition in Vedic study that repetitions are considered a defect, oftentimes whenever you find a repetitious passage, Shankaracharya in his commentary will say that although repetitions can be defective, here it's not a problem. And the reason it's not a problem is, he said that just as a mother, when she wants to impress an idea upon her child, will keep on repeating it. Not because the mother has forgotten, I have told this before, but keeps on to kind of impress it upon the child's mind that it got to be done. And sometimes children, especially when they become teenagers, get annoyed. Like, how many times are you going to tell me that? I've heard you. And yet the parents will still go on saying, no, you got to do. And so Shankaracharya in his commentary says, the Upanishad is like the mother. It's not just one mother. He says 1,000 mothers put together, and that's why the Upanishads never tire of saying, you are the Atman, and in so many different ways. And the idea is that because we are so prone to forgetting it, we need to be told again and again and again. Even those of us who have studied the conversations of Sri Ramakrishna in that book, Gospel of Ramakrishna, we know it's not like every page there is a different story or lots of stories are repeated, lots of songs are repeated, lots of teachings are repeated over and over and over again. And yet we know that it's helpful because we forget so often. We need to be told that again and again. And that's why don't worry if you find certain adjectives, certain ideas being repeated. That's for our own good. When you come to verses, so before I go there, let me point out one more thing. And it is this, that those who have made a deep study of the Gita feel that the essential teachings that Krishna wanted to give Arjuna have been given in the second chapter. And the reason they say that is the structure of the second chapter fits in with the classical model of a Vedanta text. So in the beginning, of course, we see this confused Arjuna who requests to be accepted as a disciple. So there is this disciple approaching the teacher. The teacher accepts the student and gives the teaching. And that's the portion that we saw just now, the teaching of the Atman. Then the next section, verses beginning with, for instance, the let's look at verses 47 and 48 especially. They are the two verses which are the heart of the practice of Karma Yoga. And so you find that in the beginning, Krishna gives the teaching, the nature of the self, then he gives the practice of what you must do in order to get that knowledge. And the first thing you need to do is to purify your heart. Because knowledge, as it is seen in the, not just in the Gita, but in the Vedanta tradition, oftentimes we think about knowledge as something being put inside us by someone. But because Vedanta looks at everything from a subjective standpoint, the Vedantic approach is that knowledge is not something that comes from outside. We have right now, at this very moment, we have all the knowledge in the world. Then you say, wow, I don't feel. Some people feel they are all knowing, but that's a kind of a deeper form of ignorance. But if we are honest about it, we feel, no, I'm not an enlightened being. So if all the knowledge is there, why don't I feel enlightened? And the reason is there is something that is covering that knowledge. And so what scriptures can do, what our teachers can do, is help us remove that covering. So all we need to do is to remove that covering, because knowledge is already there inside. No one can put knowledge within us. They can only help. It's a little bit like Swami Vivekananda gives the example of when you plant a seed in the garden. The power within that seed, the potentiality within that seed to grow up into a plant and a tree, that's within that seed. You are not growing that plant. You might think you are, but the seed just grows because the power is within that seed. Now what you can do is plant that seed well, provide a good organic food, give water, make sure that it gets enough sunshine, make sure that there are not any rabbits and squirrels there to come and steal it away. Sometimes they do in our garden. So you can protect it. You can protect the seed. You can give it the necessary ingredients, but the growth happens from within the seed. That's what all teachers do, whether it's a secular education or spiritual education, that they will provide the right environment, provide the right ingredients, but the flowering of knowledge occurs from within us. And so this practice here, which is really become the heart of Karma Yoga, is to purify that heart. The reason I'm not able to see and experience myself as the Atman is because my heart is covered. It's if your mirror is covered with a lot of dirt, then you can't see your reflection in it clearly. And so doing work selflessly, that is what will clear. That's why the word that is used in Sanskrit is called Chitta Shuddhi, purification of the mind. And so these are the verses. Verses 47, it's a very well-known verse, often quoted. Karmanye vadhikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana ma karma phalahe turbhur ma te sangostva karmani. Thy right is to work only, but never to the fruits thereof. Be thou not the producer of the fruits of actions, neither let thy attachment be towards inaction. And then the next verse. So these two verses from the heart of Karma Yoga. I would also like to draw your attention to verses 49 through 53 of chapter 2. Now, of course, the translations, depending on whichever book you are reading, if you are able to read the Sanskrit, or if you see the transliterated form of it, if your book has it, one thing common in all of these verses, from 49 to 53, is the word buddhi. The word buddhi sometimes buddhi yoga, sometimes gets translated here. For instance, in this translation it says, buddhi yoga means work performed with the mind undisturbed. In verse 50, the word again buddhi yukta comes in. It's translated here as endued with evenness of mind. Again, a similar word comes in verse 51, again translated as evenness of the mind. So the word buddhi comes in 4 or 5 of these verses, 49 through 53. And this is a very important word, buddhi. Oftentimes, there are students of the Gita who feel that this is one of the very key words that needs to be kept in mind. What does buddhi really mean? Now, of course, it can be translated as evenness of the mind. Sometimes buddhi gets translated as the intellect. Buddhi also has a deeper meaning. And again, it's not the word itself. You'll have to just see in what context it is said, because sometimes the buddhi can simply be translated as intellect. But here, specifically in these words, what Krishna is referring to is a higher form of the intellect. That part of the intellect which remains closed in most people. So it's a little bit like someone gives you a place to stay and says, oh, these 2 rooms are for you, but there are these 5 other rooms which are locked, no access, no password for those places, you can't go there. And so if you are like, okay, I would love to have 7 rooms, but if 2 rooms, that's fine, I'll manage in my 2 rooms. And that's a very crude example, but essentially the mind that we have now, we are not using the entirety of our mind. In fact, I've heard one of our very elderly monks once say that, and it's kind of shocking in some ways, he said that most people use just 1 or 2% of the capacity of the mind. And he said that most of our ordinary requirements of daily life, 2% of the mind is fine. You don't need more. People will think if you have access to 3% of your mind, people will think you are above average. If you have access to 4%, people might think, oh, this person seems to be a genius. And then, I mean, this is just a very rough way of expressing it. The idea is to show that the mind has enormous potentiality. And many of us are not even aware of it. But those who are, the yogis have said that if someone could have open up even up to 10% of the mind, that person might get a Nobel Prize or maybe considered a genius, I think. But even that is not enough in order to be spiritually enlightened, because 90% of the mind is still under the darkness. Which is why in the Vedic system of education, when a student went to the teacher's place to study, the very first thing, before anything else, the first thing that the teacher taught the student was the Gayatri prayer. And the Gayatri prayer is essentially to awaken this buddhi, this 90%, 95% of the buddhi which is lying dormant, asleep. Doors are locked. So the Gayatri is a way to unlock those doors. And once we have access to this enormous power of the mind, then all of these things that Krishna has said before becomes very clear. So that is the Buddhi Yoga, opening of the mind. And this opening of the mind, this access to the full potential of the mind can come only when the mind becomes pure. And the mind can become pure only when I become truly selfless. And that true selflessness is what Karma Yoga is about. So as long as, and in Karma Yoga, there is no distinction between secular work and spiritual work. Karma means activity. It does make a difference between ethical work and unethical work. So whatever work I do, so long as it is moral, so long as it is ethical, so long as it doesn't violate basic morality and ethics, if I'm able to do that work, which is right, which is good, if I do it in a selfless way, without calculating my self-interest at every instance, that will purify my heart. If it purifies my heart, that pure heart will open that mind. And with that enormous power unleashed on the mind, all these teachings about the Atman will become very clear. Not just intellectually, I'll begin to experience it. So, in the beginning, Arjuna approaches Krishna, requests to be taken as a student. Krishna gives him the teaching of the Atman, gives him this practice of Karma Yoga. Purify your heart. And then he teaches Buddhi Yoga. That's why those 5 verses where this word Buddhi comes. And then, in the section that comes later, which we will see next week, there are these characteristics of the enlightened being. So what happens when my heart becomes pure? When I realize the truth? When I become enlightened? What exactly happens to me? What are the benefits of that practice? And which is why students have the Gita, who studied it in depth, say, this is a complete text in itself. The second chapter. The disciple goes to the teacher gives the teaching, gives the student a practice, and then explains to the student what are the benefits of that practice. And the chapter ends with showing this is what happens to an enlightened being. End. Now, they say that if Arjuna had been a student of the highest category, so sometimes they say there are three kinds of students. There is a highest category of student, and all that the teacher has to, when the student who is like ready, ripe for knowledge, all that student has to do is to hear from the teacher, Shravana, hearing. Just the teacher has to say, Tattvamasi, you are that. And then the student gets up and saying, Aham Brahmasmi, I am the Infinite One. Gets up and walks. Nothing more. End of chapter. But if one is not, such highest category of students are always necessarily less. It would be great if we were like that. You don't need to study the book. You don't need anything. Just hear from the teacher. You are the Infinite One. Get up. Problem solved. But it hasn't happened so far in many of our cases. So we keep on hearing, you are the Infinite, you are the Atman, you are Brahman. I say, oh yeah. and then doubts come to mind. They're like, how can this possible? It doesn't feel that way. So when doubts start coming, then the teacher says, well, now reflect on it. Do some reflection so that doubts will go. And then even after reflection, it says, well, I think intellectually I'm satisfied. Intellectually it makes sense, but it's not changing what I'm experiencing. So my reflection is not enough. Then the teacher says, okay, then you do some meditation on it. Then meditate on it. Go deeper exploration. Do a deeper exploration of it. So the topmost student will understand immediately. The middling student, the Madhyama Adhikari, will understand it after a little bit of reflection. Will experience it. But if you don't experience it even after reflection, then you have to keep on exploring it in depth. Keep on meditating. And that's called the Adhamadhikari. And in all humility, we don't have to feel bad about it to say, I'm a student of the lowest category, which is fine. And so we need to then keep on reminding ourselves about this again and again. Now, Arjuna, luckily for us, I don't know whether luckily or unluckily, well, if Arjuna had been the brightest of students, then the very first verse, when think about it this way, in the 11th verse, when Krishna says, Ashocchanan vashochastam, you should not be grieving, you are that infinite. And then Arjuna would say, oh, I am the infinite. Okay, I'm ready to fight. Then the Gita would have been like just 50 verses. So, kind of good news. You don't have to study a big book for it. The bad news is, we may not be as qualified a student as Arjuna was. And then we're like, well, it made sense to Arjuna, it doesn't make sense to us. Luckily for us, Arjuna was not the brightest light, brightest bulb in town. So he was, I'm sure none of us is as great an archer as Arjuna was. But I think, again, I've not met Arjuna, so I don't know. But I think Arjuna was more or less like most of us. And so even though Krishna gave this great teaching, Arjuna was like, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. And so from chapter 3 till the end of the book is an extended question-answer session. So if Arjuna had no questions, then the Gita would have ended. But Arjuna had lots of questions. And you probably have lots of questions too. So I'm going to take a look, and then we'll see. If there are, I haven't yet seen whether you have put any questions. I'm going to open my computer now and see it. If there are no questions here, I'm going to assume all of you are students of the highest category. So let's see what kind of students you are. All right, let's see. No student. Wow. Oh, really no questions. Oh, that's great. So, I'm wondering whether we should continue with the Gita next Sunday. If what we will know, we will have Gita next Sunday, but if we find that no one has tuned in, I'm going to assume all of you have already become enlightened. Then we'll see what to do. So, okay. So just to summarize what we saw today, there are two things. First, in the beginning, we saw the importance of identity. Then we saw how the second chapter is a complete text in itself because it has all the ingredients in a classical, the arrangement of factors, the theoretical teaching, the practice, and the benefit of the practice. So it's, but since the Gita continues afterwards, it's an extended question-answer session. We also saw the importance of the word buddhi. And going forward, we will have more opportunity to explore the meaning of buddhi and how it is so important to reflect on in our daily spiritual practice. So these are the things. And then next week, we will very briefly take a look at the significance of those two verses on Karma Yoga, and then see the last section of the second chapter, where Krishna describes the characteristics of the enlightened. The word that gets used here is called sthita prajna. Sthita means to be established. Prajna means wisdom. So one whose wisdom is established, one who, to put it in the language that we have been using in today, we can say that one whose identity as the Atman has now become fixed. One who has no doubt whatsoever, not just intellectually, but because of direct experience, one who knows I am the Atman. How would such a person behave? How would such a person live? So that will be the concluding section of this chapter, which we will study next Sunday. Om जननीं सारदां देवीं रामकृष्णं जगद्गुरुं पादपद्मे तयो श्रित्वा प्रणमामि मुहुर्मुहुः।
अथ चेत्त्वमिमं धर्म्यं सङ्ग्रामं न करिष्यसि ततः स्वधर्मं कीर्तिं च हित्वा पापमवाप्स्यसि अकीर्तिं चापि भूतानि कथयिष्यन्ति ते व्ययाम् सम्भावितस्य चाकीर्तिः मरणादतिरिच्यते भयाद्रणादु परतम् हंस्यन्ते त्वाम् महारथाः येषाम् च त्वम् बहुमतः भूत्वा यास्यसि लाघवम् अवाच्यवादांश्च बहून् वदिष्यन्ति तवाहिताः निन्दन्तस्तव सामर्थ्यम् ततो दुःखतरम्